Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining Jabe and I to talk about psychological safety and organizational resilience at this Transformation Live session. Uh, I'm just going to do a quick introduction. We're going to do some quick introduction round before we dive into the topic itself. So hi everyone, I'm Tom, and I'm Transformation Lead at Red Hat Open Innovation Labs. You can find me online at Tom_Gerety and on LinkedIn, or by emailing tom@redhat.com. And you can go to that link there, red.ht/labs, to find out more about Open Innovation Labs. If you don't know me or know about me, my background is, for the past 15, 20 years, a series of CTO and CIO kind of roles. And around 10-ish years ago, I sort of discovered the concept of psychological safety, for myself at least, by the experience of a rather terrible boss, typical, stereotypical, awful, shouty, blamey boss, and the impact that it had. And from that point on, I realized I needed to work out what the opposite of that was and wanted to do that. I'm also studying for a master's degree in global public health and humanitarianism, and I'm going to hand over to Jabe now for his intro.
Hi guys, my name is Jabe Bloom. I'm part of Red Hat's Global Transformation Office. I've been at Red Hat for about a year and a half. I work with Andrew Clay Schaefer and Kevin Bear and Willis, all kind of luminaries from the DevOps movement. And the topic of kind of burnout and psychological safety, culture and resilience, all are topics that we have been exploring for a while in that community, and I'm super excited to come and talk to you guys about those ideas today. When I'm not doing this, when I'm not working at the GTO at Red Hat, I am getting my PhD at Carnegie Mellon, where I study the interaction between technology, social practice, and design. In theory, I will finish writing my dissertation any day now.
Thanks, Jabe. So we're going to be talking psychological safety, but first I would like to introduce this woman, Grace Hopper. She's one of my leadership role models, probably my main leadership role model. Grace Hopper was born in 1906, and she got a PhD in maths from Yale, became a professor at Vassar University, and tried to join the Navy in 1940, but she got rejected because she was 34 years old, and so she joined the reserves instead. Now, Grace began her computing career in 1944 when she worked on the Harvard Mark I team. And it was Grace Hopper that eventually popularized it was Grace Hopper's work that popularized the concept of machine-independent programming languages, which led to things like COBOL. During her lifetime, she was granted 40 honorary degrees and became US Navy Rear Admiral. She died in 1992. She said this, she said, "You manage things and you lead people." And of course, she's absolutely right. You know, we don't manage people and lead things. And the two are very different approaches. Technology is stuff and people are people, and they require different approaches. It sounds fairly obvious, though you'd be surprised at how often people are managed in the same way that things are. Also, when you put things and people, or technology and people together, you have what we call a socio-technical system. And remember that word because we'll probably be coming back to it quite soon. And I'd like to talk about Chernobyl, because Chernobyl is a great example of not only, well, maybe not a great, an example of a lack of good leadership, but also of a poor socio-technical integration. We could talk loads about the impact of human factors and ergonomics and stuff like that, and the causes that they had in the Chernobyl disaster. But right now, I'm going to focus on safety culture. And this was in 1986, when the Chernobyl disaster occurred. And in 1986, in Russia, economic and political interests came way before safety. Hierarchy, authority, and the blame for mistakes ultimately caused the incident. But the plant itself also had an inherently unsafe design. There was also fear of authority and certainly no safety culture. In fact, the official findings of the disaster state the design parameters and characteristics of the RBMK 1000 reactor violated the safety standards and regulations so seriously that it could only be operated in a country where there was an inadequate safety culture. Now, what happened in the disaster itself was that a safety test was carried out to simulate a power cut. And this had been run many times before, but never quite successfully. And on this occasion, it was delayed. The second shift team came on, who were less familiar with the system. But because there was no safety culture, because they were afraid of authority and they'd get blamed for mistakes, they couldn't raise their concerns. They couldn't raise their concerns that they didn't quite know how to use or execute this procedure. And the test was executed, it went wrong and led to a catastrophic series of events culminating in 2 explosions. One steam explosion that destroyed the reactor and one subsequent second nuclear explosion. Now, 31 people died as a result, as a direct result of this, but 4,000 people died in total. And all fundamentally because the engineers didn't feel safe enough to raise their concerns. Now, if we skip forward a few years to 1999, this is Dr. Amy Edmondson, a professor at Harvard Business School. And she was studying clinical teams. She was studying high-performing and low-performing clinical teams. And she was looking at the teams with the best outcomes, the high-performing ones, the best outcomes being where more people survived, and versus the teams with poorer outcomes, the poor-performing teams, the ones where more people died. And what she found was that the best performing teams made more mistakes than the low performing teams. And that didn't make sense. And in fact, what she initially thought that she had there was a transposing error and the data was the wrong way around. So she went off and checked the data and dived into it a bit more. And what she found was that the best teams admitted more mistakes. They held their hand up and they admitted their mistakes. So she came up with this concept. Well, she knew of the concept. She gave it this definition. She gave psychological safety the definition, the belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. And it's a group phenomenon. It's an aggregate measure of the degree of interpersonal trust, comfort, and commitment felt by team members in that space. And being psychologically safe means being able to run safe-to-learn experiments. It means feeling safe delivering news that a recipient might not want to hear. It means being able to express diverse opinions, ask for help, and admit mistakes. And incidentally, Sidney Dekker, who we might come across a bit later on, found the same thing with airlines. The airlines that report more incidents actually have a lower passenger mortality risk. So there's this inverse correlation between the number of incidents reported, the honesty and the willingness to take on that conversation about what might go wrong and things that have gone wrong, and things actually going wrong. So let's think about that. Think about the best team you've been part of, the team that you really enjoyed being part of, the team that really got stuff done, experimented, and was fun to be part of. And not only was it fun to be part of, but you really made things happen. Now, chances are that team wasn't great just because they were skilled, intelligent, hardworking, although maybe they were all those things. Chances are the team was great because they trusted each other. Everyone on the team felt safe to be on the team as themselves, as their true selves. Everyone on the team were able to admit mistakes, ask for help, suggest ideas and contribute ideas for innovation, and challenge each other in positive ways. And think about the worst team you've been part of. The team where you couldn't speak up, you couldn't be yourself, you couldn't trust each other or rely on each other not to act in self-interest. So not only is this a pretty awful situation to be in, but performance takes a huge hit. Mistakes are hidden, potentially great ideas don't even get suggested, poor decisions don't get challenged, and ultimately the team might break up as a result. Now, so we know it's really nice to be on a team. We know it's really nice to be psychologically safe on a team. We know it feels good, and we know you might get more stuff done and admit your mistakes and stuff like that. But does it actually make money? Does it make a difference to an organization? And this is from Google's Project Aristotle that you might be aware of from 2012. So this is 13 years after Amy Edmondson's research into clinical teams. And Google were looking at the 5 most important factors for high-performing teams. And they found 4, these bottom 4, impact, meaning, structure and clarity, and dependability. And they knew something was missing because there was still a difference in the really high performing teams. There was still a missing factor. And so one of the Project Aristotle team members found Amy Edmondson's paper on psychological safety and decided to measure it across these teams. And what they found was that psychological safety was the key factor, the primary factor for all high-performing teams. That is, all high-performing teams in Google possessed psychological safety, and none of the lower-performing teams possessed it. This is really interesting, and it's not the only evidence. The State of DevOps report over the past 8 years shows that an organizational culture that optimizes for information flow, trust, innovation, and risk sharing predicts performance. So there's a lot of data out there, including these charts. These are from the DevOps report as well. These are the factors that boost productivity across an entire organization, and you can see the sort of keystone at the top there is psychological safety. And the same applies to software delivery teams' performance. All these things impact the ability of software delivery teams to deliver quality software. But again, right at the top, and this keystone factor is psychological safety. And this is an interesting point, because when I first started talking about psychological safety, there was really only 1 or 2 books about it, and now there's loads. I mean, this is just a sample, but 8 of these 9 books were published in the past 18 months. So what I'm saying here is that more and more people, more and more leaders and organizations are learning that psychological safety is the key, being high performing, responding to change, and being innovative and resilient. Part of that is the pandemic and what's happened over the past 18 months or a year or so. People have realized that it's so important. Now, one of these books you'll see is written by Amy Edmondson, the Fearless organization, based upon her research and all the work that she's done. This will actually be raffling. We'll be raffling 4 copies of this, I believe. So if you hang around to the end of this talk, then you're in with a chance of getting a copy of this book. So we know it's good to have psychological safety. We know more people are realizing this, but how do you know if your team, if the people you work with possess psychological safety? Well, one of the ways you can do it is by measuring agreement with these statements. And we won't go through each one, but essentially these talk about whether you can take a risk, whether you can ask for help, whether your team has behaviors that reflect and improve psychological safety, such as attempting to find the systemic root cause of failures rather than blaming people. Now, what's interesting about these questions, because you can't survey people without affecting people, and we might talk about this a bit later. So by asking these questions, you're doing a number of things. First of all, you're surfacing any issues that impact psychological safety. Secondly, you're educating people about what it is. We're teaching people what psychological safety fundamentally is. Thirdly, you're making it a safe thing to talk about. It's a bit meta, but you're making psychological safety psychologically safe to talk about in the team. And finally, probably most importantly, you're encouraging the very behaviors that actually increase psychological safety. So, say you've done a survey, you know where you are, and you know you want to improve, and you're thinking, oh, how do I do this? Well, as a leader, this is really on you. You can't simply tell people they operate in a safe environment. That sounds fairly obvious, right? But you need to prove it. You need to act it and be it and live it. I like the phrase that one of the best ways of building psychological safety is to pretend it already exists. And so I'm just going to highlight a few of the things on this slide, which is providing clarity, because it speaks to Google's Project Aristotle. People need to know what to do, how to do it, like the definition of done stuff, like what not to do, when to do it. All that clarity is one of the main drivers of psychological safety. Another real big driver is setting the team values and behaviors, and this needs to be done with the team. So whatever team you're in, whether it's a short-lived team or a long-lived team, really important to define collectively the values and behaviors that the team expect of each other. Because this also, if we look at a bit further down, you can see being firm with negative behaviors is really crucial. But you can't be firm with negative behaviors if you haven't already set these boundaries and expectations, this social contract. One of the other things we're going to talk about probably a bit later is the retrospectives and root cause analyses. These are practices that really improve psychological safety, and they improve performance because they actually fix things that are going wrong, and maybe help teams stop making mistakes, or at least highlighting, enabling an environment where it's okay to admit mistakes and say something's wrong. It's also worth noting that there's a whole other world with distributed and remote teams, because the world's changed. In the past year, or at least most of us, I think, have gone fully remote. And this dramatic shift in these ways of working has resulted in disruption to our routines. So I'm going to talk about routines and boundaries here, particularly because these are really, really important. Routines help us as humans feel much more comfortable and psychologically safe when the world around us is changing and there's so much uncertainty elsewhere, and we can root ourselves in routine. And I'm really interested in the impact of ritual as well. Ritual is really important in building community, building teams, and is a great way to improve psychological safety. So one of the things I'm really interested in is if any of you folks on the call have any team rituals that you use regularly, and how important they are to psychological safety. It's also important to note boundaries, because boundaries right now have been really, really blurred. It's hard to know. When we used to get to the office at say 9 or whatever and leave at 5:30, and you'd know that you'd got to work and finished work. Now the times that we start work, the times that we have breaks, the times that we finish work are blurring. The space that we're working in is blurred because it's at home. We don't necessarily have our own home office space. Hard to know sometimes if we're at work or not. Sounds crazy, but it really is. And so it's really important to help you and your team set those boundaries. It's a really great way of increasing psychological safety. And I think this is a really useful model, because this talks about what that looks like in a team when teams are going through this increasing stages of psychological safety. This is from Tim Clark's 4 stages, and it's flawed like any good model. It's wrong but useful. And the first stage is inclusion safety. It's this basic level psychological safety on a team. We need to belong. We just need to be accepted. Essentially, the first stage is simply being comfortable, being present. And the second stage is learner safety. This is a sort of a little bit increased psychological safety where you can ask questions, you can experiment and make and admit mistakes. The third stage is contributor safety, where teams feel more psychologically safe. They're more able to participate, contribute ideas and suggestions, because contributing ideas can be a highly vulnerable thing to do, but it's super powerful. And the fourth stage, the most challenging stage to get to, is challenger safety, challenging the ideas of other people in the team, even if they're much more senior. And this also means challenging the way we do things, the standard, the traditions of the team. And at stage 4, in fact, as in many stages through this process, team members are happy. Very few high-performing teams are unhappy. High-performing teams are not happy because they're high-performing. They're high-performing because they're happy. But it's worth noting that is being psychologically safe enough on its own for performance? Well, it isn't. It isn't. Just psychologically safety on its own isn't enough to have a really high-performing team. You also need drive, or motivation, accountability, and persistence. I prefer drive. Amy Edmondson created this matrix and actually used the word accountability, but I feel that accountability is a bit of a consequences kind of word. Like if you don't have accountability, something bad will happen. So I prefer drive because we create our own drive. And I think it's really interesting to play with this and examine what it's like to be in each quadrant, where if you look at the bottom left corner, for example, you've got low psychological safety, low drive, and that's the apathy zone. No one really cares about getting anything done, but neither do you need to. And if we move over to the right, you've got high drive but low safety, and that's the anxiety zone. This is a highly competitive, stressful, anxious zone. And then in top left, comfort zone, where you've got a high degree of psychological safety but low drive. And this might be a really nice, comfy place to be, but you're not going to get much stuff done. And you get stuff done, you get a lot done in the performance zone. This is also called the learning zone. And it's where you've got high psychological safety and high drive. And so it's safe to take risks, it's safe to innovate, it's safe to contribute ideas. And it's not only a good, fun place to be, but it gets stuff done. Now, it's useful. You can play with this chart. You can play with this with your teams. You can put this on a wall and talk to people about, oh, where are you on this chart? Where have you been in the past? Where do we want to be? This is a great workshop tool. It's super. What's also interesting to note is that as a manager or as a leader, you can use this quite strategically to try and move people into their comfort zone first, essentially, because this is a bit like the game Snakes and Ladders, where it's easier to move down than it is to move up. It's quite hard work to move up in psychological safety, but easy to accidentally come down. And you want to avoid falling back into that anxiety zone, because that's a really, really bad place to be. So strategically, you could move people up into the comfort zone and then over into the performance zone. This can be a good strategic thing to do with your team. Now, this is the stage where I hand over to Jabe, and we're going to start talking about resilience engineering and learning organizations, and how psychological safety is a fundamental factor in this, a fundamental capability within learning organizations. So here we go.
All right, so next slide after the title slide. So the first thing to kind of point out about resilience engineering, which is different than kind of robustness engineering or kind of traditional engineering approaches, and part of why psychological safety becomes a critical aspect of this is because resilience engineering assumes that the system that you're working on is complex, and therefore there will be new emergent behaviors, either positive or negative, so that not necessarily failure, but new opportunities for learning, constantly emerging out of the system. That's one of the things that we would see. There's surprises, and I think one of there's a good moment to kind of point out that, like, when we think about that. So within like an SRE or site reliability engineering frame, we might actually be able to define what toil is, and the idea of removing toil from a system. So the way we could kind of use this insight is to say that toil is the unsurprising repetitive activities that happen inside of a complex system. So things that we've seen a bunch of times that are no longer surprising, but that we have to constantly remediate. Those things are toil. So what we want to do when we talk about kind of resilience engineering and some of these other ideas about how to kind of embrace new ways of working is optimize the system for surprise by actually reducing toil, which is the unsurprising work that we have to do consistently just to keep the system working. So that's maybe one of the initial things that we might start thinking about when we start thinking about resilience engineering is that reduction in toil. What's the next slide? So the counterbalance to this, right? The counterbalance, this idea of, or not even counterbalance, but the kind of a corollary implication of working in a complex system is that if you were doing, again, kind of engineering that's based in traditional robustness theory, the idea that we could make the system failure-proof, safety-proofed, right? In other words, like try to reduce the number of errors to zero. That whole set of theory that says that you could create a system, let's say, that releases no defects, like there's no escaped defects in production. If that's a goal, then one of the corollary theories is that we could find the root cause of all failures in the system in some way, remove all those causes, and then we would have a system that would be able to perform perfectly. It would be able to perform without error. And that ends up being these kind of analysis of root cause problems. Now, in technical systems, in purely technical systems, things like, let's say, a clock, you probably can find the root cause for why a clock isn't currently running. You go in, the battery's dead, or this gear fell off, or something like that. And the cause of the clock not running can be understood because by replacing the battery or replacing the gear, the clock begins working again. So you found the root cause of the clock not running. When you start kind of widening the lens and thinking of the system as a socio-technical system or a complex system, the questions end up being slightly differently thought through. Like, is this clock one of many clocks that are being maintained by many different humans? And how often do the gears fall off? And is that related in some way to the way the humans interact with the clocks, the manufacturing of the clocks, humidity, weather? Like, maybe there's actually a bunch of different contributing causes and not just a single contributing cause to why clocks gears fall out or clock batteries die. And therefore what we end up with is this idea that there's no one root cause in a complex system. Instead, there's a multitude of contributing factors that cause undesirable behavior of the system. But that those cannot be eliminated completely, and the single root cause is unlikely to be found. Now, there's another aspect of this is really important to understand, and this kind of comes largely from, I think, a set of theory from American pragmatism. And the set of theory here has to do with fallibility and fallibility of systems and the importance of remaining, of balancing confidence versus doubt. So the problem with identifying root cause or a particular cause inside of most social systems, so most social organizations, is that it stops the inquiry. People no longer ask what went wrong. They think we found what went wrong. We don't have to think about it anymore. And the problem with that is often in a complex system, it's not one thing, it's multiple things. And one of the ways I like to think about this is just to say two things. One is, if you accept complexity and complex systems theory, you want to keep causality a little bit weird. It shouldn't be fully explanatory. It should be good guesses about what happened as opposed to the final answer, in order to keep the inquiry going inside the system. And the second thing to say is that often when we see organizations that use root cause or blameful culture, they tell really boring stories. The stories aren't very interesting. There's not much to solve. The reason why this system went down was because Tom didn't do his job right. It's just not a very interesting story, because what are we going to do about, I guess God, send Tom to more training or fire Tom. Those things don't answer questions like, why did Tom think it was a good idea to do the thing that he did in the situation that he was in? Did the system offer him options that were bad? Did he not have any good options? What was it about the situation that enabled Tom to make those decisions? And, just a really quick side note, in aviation, the famous version of this story is there was a plane that crashed quite frequently, and they were trying to determine why the plane was crashing quite frequently. And what they eventually determined was that there was two levers next to the pilot that had the same shape and the same feel, and one of them deployed the flaps, and the other one revved the engine. And the problem was that people were reaching down to put the engine at full thrust, and they were grabbing the flaps deployment and pushing that instead. And of course, if you want to go faster and you deploy the flaps, the plane slows down significantly. It doesn't go faster. And all they did to solve this problem was they reoriented the flap handle so that it felt different. So that when the pilot would grab the wrong handle, they would immediately go, "That's not the right handle. I'm not holding on to the right thing." So again, that has to do with reconfiguring, rethinking about what options appear available to the operator of the system at any one point in time. Anyway, next slide. So when we talk about resilience, the other thing we talk about when we talk about resilience is this idea that resilience isn't a property of a technical system. So one of the ways to think about that is, again, go back to our clocks. Clocks can't be resilient. Clocks have no inherent resilience. Clocks gain resilience because there's humans in the system that make them resilient. Same thing with any software. Software cannot react to unpredictable surprises. Software has no way, hardware, software networks, hard drives, CPUs don't work well in surprising situations. And so one of the ways to think about this is that there's a term that I love to use to just kind of describe this. All systems, instead of thinking of your system as being operable or inoperable, it's either working correctly or it's not working correctly. It's in a failure mode or it's in a success mode. So the thing about that, the better way to think about most software in large enterprises all over the planet is that it's in a state of what's called continuous partial failure. And that means it looks like it's running fine, but almost certainly something's going wrong somewhere. And so the resilience of the system is the ability for the system to be in continuous partial failure. So there's always failing a little bit, but that the humans that are involved with the system, in the socio-technical system, are making the system be capable of responding to those subtle variations in traffic, utilization, new feature deployment, blah, blah, blah. There's a whole bunch of human beings that are the glue that enable the system to respond to those things. And in this case, you get these ideas that resilience is an activity that humans do. It's not a property they instill in a system. And the things that they do are they anticipate what might happen, and they try to prevent bad things from happening. But they also try to guess, if I do this, what will happen, so that if that doesn't happen, they notice that what they thought was going to happen didn't happen. So that allows them to respond faster. They detect, they sense what's missing, what's happening. They're capable of responding, so they have enough free time, free space, and capability to respond to it. And finally, they're able to take the time to learn from errors and mistakes about the nature of the system and what to do about it. Next one. So again, when we look at a system, when we kind of think about a system, we want to make it resilient. We can say that it's resilient if it's capable of effectively responding to surprise, unexpected events, unknown, unanticipated events. And again, I would link this back to the conversation that Tom had about psychological safety, because one of the first things that happens when people get surprised is if the surprise or the amount of information that's generated by the event is too great, they feel threatened by it. They shut down, they have a harder time responding to it. And so the more psychological safety an organization has, the more they're capable of kind of staying in control through surprising or unexpected events. And so part of the resilience effort is to create the psychological safety that allows people to stay in a flow state, stay in a engaged, we can work our way through this. This is not an unusual thing. The system is in some state of failure at all times way of working. And to the extent that systems are allowed to kind of get into a position where the amount of information they generate in an event is large, in other words, the event creates large amounts of unexpected information or cascading other events, that is when the system becomes unresilient, because the humans involved are no longer capable of responding to those surprises. So, next one, Tom. So I usually try to break this down as a set of tensions that teams are trying to navigate through in order to create more resilience. And the tensions that I usually point out are the tension between efficacy and adaptability. So, efficiency and adaptability. So efficiency means kind of reproducing the same behaviors and outcomes with as minimal effort as possible, whereas adaptability is the ability to respond to new and novel events by changing the system to be more capable of responding. So you get a tension there. And then we have a tension between coherence and diversity, where the idea is that in a resilient organization, there's a lot of different ways of seeing the same system, so that we have a spread of investment in our cognitive abilities, looking at the system in different ways, because each different perspective kind of highlights or gives us an ability to see the system in a different way, versus coherence, which is that all the people can communicate to each other. So we can't have so much diversity that no one knows what anybody else is doing, but we can't have so much uniformity that no one is looking at parts of the system in a different way, so that we kind of lose that advantage. So we get those two major balances. And I kind of usually start talking about these as the difference between a chrono space-time, or a regular beat, a regular heartbeat, or a kind of a pattern of behavior, a set of habits, like Tom was talking about, so that there's an expectation of what might happen next. There's a reason to expect there will be a sequence of events at work. The things will work in a certain kind of way. And that tends to support efficiency and coherence. And then there's another kind of sense of the way that time passes, which is kairotic time. The kairotic time is the ability to respond to surprises. It's the ability to react to emergent or unexpected events. So we get this idea that these two things are actually in tension with each other. And I think it's really important to point out that the reason people can't respond to surprises unless they're actually surprising. And what makes them surprising is that they're not what was expected to happen in the regular order of events, which means that you must have a pre-existing regular order of events in order to be surprised. Because otherwise, everything is just chaos and nothing's surprising, but everything's new, right? And so it's the balance between order and surprise, or order and unexpected events, that actually gives the organization the opportunity to respond. So lacking order means you can't have any resilience, because you don't know what to respond to anymore. Next slide, Tom. And so we get these kind of tensions that I like to talk about, and you saw some of them in Woods' ideas, where what we're trying to do is kind of balance the interaction between our ability to anticipate, detect, and respond, create a learning organization where the organization values the integration of information, the processing of new events and new ways of working, in order to create common ground and what's called interpredictability, roughly the idea that we need a minimum shared vocabulary, not a maximum, but a minimum shared vocabulary, and a minimum set of things that it seems reasonable to do, so that people can trust each other, frankly. And that's one of the kind of impacts on psychological safety, is that if I'm over here in the corner and I'm doing just crazy stuff and nobody understands why I'm doing it, then the system has probably broken the coherence of my actions and made me not predictable to the rest of the organization, which means that people probably won't trust what I'm doing, but B, the results that I produce. So there's this activity in a learning organization, which is the integration of novel practices, novel behaviors, and novel information that doesn't need to be fully understood by every other team. Like, you don't have to agree with me. You just shouldn't be surprised that I'm doing it. And that's kind of the way in which interpredictability plays in. And then finally, it's important to recognize in a resilient organization that efficiency is the source of the ability for the system to do other things. So an inefficient system will be so overwhelmed by toil that it will be unable to react to surprising situations. It'll be overburdened. So efficiency is a source of resilience as well, because it involves a reduction in toil. it involves a reduction in operational burden and cost of change. And those reductions and the value created by them can be reinvested in the activities of creating a learning organization and becoming more responsive. Next slide, Tom. I think I'm almost done. Yes, and so we talk about, again, about learning organizations. Learning organizations, part of kind of systems theory, especially kind of the fifth discipline and Senge, thinking through the idea that an organization needs to be able to reintegrate these ideas. For Senge, one of the things that I often point out to people about learning organizations, one of the reasons Senge thought that a learning organization was so critical was because he argued that an individual in an organization that can't understand how they exist in the organization's future, they don't see how what they're doing is integrated into the system's ongoing existence, that those people become highly demotivated, and then they don't have a way of acting. So part of a learning organization is the integration of those individuals' expectations of the system and of themselves so that they can see themselves in the system's future. So that's a kind of a critical part, I think, of these learning organizations, the psychological safety, understanding that the impact of my behaviors on others and on the system in a way that invests me in the system's future because I believe that I exist in the system's future. Anyway, next one, Tom. Gretchen, this will be available later. We'll send out videos to everyone. Last thing, because I'm a designer and I get really concerned about both resilience engineering and psychological safety because they tend to be idealisms. They tend to be psychological factors or social factors. And I think materiality is an important, critical, foundational part of establishing those things. So my good friend Ryan here says, before you can engineer resilience, you must engineer the conditions which it's possible to engineer resilience. So what are those types of conditions, and how might we think about them? How is technology related to resilience? So I said before, technology can't be resilient. Humans are what causes resilience. But what is technology's responsibility in a psychologically safe, resilient organization? So next slide. I call this idea socio-technical architecture, and so a socio-technical system is the joint optimization of the social system and the technical system together, from a guy named Eric Trist from Tavistock Institute, so I tend to define architecture, or the creation of the conditions of possibility for something like resilience and psychological safety, by these two different ways of thinking. And so the first one is that architecture is responsible for creating a robust and reliable technical system. And that those are often always things that are related to the physical world. And the risk of doing that poorly is usually in the design phase. And the idea is to create fail-safe systems that are physical. And so what do I mean by that? So like one of the things I might say is like, Tom and I could go off and design a bridge for you, and we could make it the most psychologically safe, resilient bridge on the planet. But if you intend to drive 15-ton trucks over it, we need to do math. We need to just figure out whether or not the bridge will withstand a 15-ton truck. And the answer is, if we come back to you and say it can, and then you drive a 15-ton truck over it and it falls over, well, we didn't do much for the resilience or psychological safety of that system. And I think the answer is, in a lot of agile transformations, and a lot of DevOps transformations, in a lot of people attempting to adopt these new ways of working, the actual architecture doesn't support the new ways of working. You're asking people to do things in a system that is just technically, at the technological level, not safe to do those things in. You can't recover quickly. You can't do rollbacks effectively. you can't roll out fast enough, you can't do integration testing at the proper pace. All of those things, if those things are not true, and then you're asking people to do cloud native kind of development and work item practices on top of that system that wasn't designed to support it, almost all the teams eventually are going to hit a wall face first at high speed, and they're going to come back and say, you told me it was safe to do this new way of working, and it wasn't because the system couldn't support it. So that's one thing, is to say that socio-technical architecture requires that lower level practice. And then the second thing is that once you get that technical system to be capable of supporting the more advanced practices, then you can focus more on things like cognitive engineering, which we'll talk about in 2 seconds, resilience engineering, and the way in which risk is now imagined as being risk in use. In other words, that you discover surprising events by doing things as opposed to planning to do things, and that the system needs to become safe to fail. So, next slide. I got to stop talking at some point, right? Last slide, cognitive load. So, the way that I would summarize this all really quickly is to say this. Systems that require human cognition in order to be resilient. People understanding what's happening right now, what are my options for fixing it, what do I need to do? And the assumption that the system is complex and therefore in a state of continuous partial failure means that it's really important that the system be engineered in a way that at least some coherent part of the system can fit in the engineer's head. And to the extent that you look at monolithical architectures, monolithical infrastructure, long-lived environments, all these things where the system kind of aggregates or grows variability, to the point where it can no longer fit in one person's head, that is when you reduce the resilience of the system. And the reason for that is because often what will happen is the system will grow to the extent that the team can just barely manage it in its happy state. And therefore, whenever there's a surprise, they actually tip the cognitive load of the organization over its ability to respond to both the normal level of variation and this activity. And the result of it is you create a very unsafe situation where people are unable to understand what's happening and unable to respond within reasonable periods of time. This ends up looking like kind of organizational design questions in relationship to software architecture. I'll leave it there, and we'll see if we have any good questions or how we want to go. What do you think, Tom? How did I do? I talked a lot.
Yeah, no, spot on, absolutely brilliant. We've got a few questions. In fact, I've got a question for you, but I think just before that, we've got a question from Judy asking. So this is a question that I've been asked multiple times in the past. Actually, can a team be too psychologically safe? And so I know my response to that would be that a team can't be too psychologically safe. But I think the challenge here is remembering that psychological safety is not the same as existential safety. And what is so? Sometimes the example I give is like a team. In fact, there was a Sherpa team, a Nepalese Sherpa team that ascended K2. But achieved the first winter summit of K2 earlier this year, and K2 kills like a third of the people that try and get to the summit. And they're a small Nepalese team, and that team, like super high performance team, super psychologically safe between them. They really trusted each other. They trusted that each other had their backs. They trusted that they could, if one of them was struggling or got frostbite or something, they'd be able to put their hand up and say, "I'm having trouble," and teammates would understand and get together and do something about it. But they were in one of the most existentially unsafe environments on the planet. And I think that's the point. A high degree of psychological safety compensates, indeed enables teams to face those sorts of challenges, really, really extreme challenges. So Yeah, that's my take. I don't think a team can be too psychologically safe because that's what enables you to face the challenges of the real world, whether it's ascending K2 or you releasing a new product.
So one of my favorite talks, I'm not going to remember the name of the woman who gave it, but I'll think of it and we'll put it in the email. She's actually was at Twitter. She was one of the data scientists at Twitter, and she was a scuba diver, and she was basically saying, there's a balance when you are scuba diving. So she does deep rig scuba diving with a rebreather, and one of the things she talks about is the idea that if the rebreather breaks, it basically injects poison into your mouth and you're done. And so she was saying there's always, you want your engineers to be aware of the threats of the environment so that they're paying attention. And psychological safety is not ignoring threats. It's being aware of threats and not feeling like you can't respond to them. So for her, part of scuba diving was knowing what those threats were so that you would pay attention to the right things and act in the right ways through any potential negative events. And that was psychological safety was part of establishing the conditions that allow you to operate through those high risk environments. So it's not about, to the extent that psychological safety, which is, to the extent that you use psychological safety, meaning people feeling safe as opposed to at risk, the question is what's at risk? System being at risk versus their personal, ability to work or their personal, job, etc. And it's differentiating those two that I think is really critical, because you want to use the psychological safety to enable them to pay attention to the threats that are being posed against, or the risks being posed against the system, just not themselves.
Yeah. And in fact, that leads really, really well onto the next thought or question that I had, which is about incidents and mistakes and failures, and I think it's John Allspor's concept of Goldilocks events, which are the sort of targeting in order to get the most out of complex cause analysis and incident reviews and stuff, targeting those events that are just the right size, size so that your psychological safety sort of matches. Because if it's too big an event, there'll be challenges in diving into the causes for all sorts of organizational and political reasons. And if the event's too small, then the reward isn't that great. But yeah, Jay, what do you think about
that? I do think that's right. I think that when you're practicing kind of, so I like to call, I follow a guy named J. Paul Reed on his description of what he calls the difference between blameful and blame aware as opposed to blame less. And so the difference is this: when organizational problems get too big, when the Goldilocks size is too much, then it tends to drag in parts of the organization, like management or higher levels, who have very little to contribute. In other words, they didn't cause the problem. They didn't cause the problem. It's not their fault, but they want to know whose fault it was because they want to know how to stop it from happening again. And therefore, the result is that it tends to drive the reflections from the group towards finding who to blame, like who is responsible. Primarily, honestly, again, because executives and managers want a name. I want a name. I want to know who is responsible. So too big tends to drive towards simplifying the story so that management can understand what happened and believe that it won't happen again. Right size, on the other hand, allows blame aware, by which it means it's one thing to say Tom was definitely involved in the incident. Therefore, he holds some blame for what happened, but we're not going to stop asking questions just because we think Tom was involved. Oh, look, like Deborah was also involved and Bill was involved. And So then we can start asking the people who were involved in the incident what happened, and get a better understanding of why they thought what they were doing was reasonable and how to change the system afterwards. So the right size event allows the story to become more complex, and it allows the story to be less driven towards resolution and more driven towards inquiry. Whereas big problems drive people towards resolution. What are we doing about this? And closure. Are we sure we understood what happened? And can you tell me it's not going to happen again? So.
Yeah. And I'm aware of sort of getting into incident stuff, which is typically resilience engineering stuff, but it's super interesting. What do you know of any actual practices? Like is there stuff that people could take away in terms of like complex cause analysis, like how to do it?
I mean, so if you talk to like John Allspaw and people who are interested in it, a lot of what they end up doing is discourse analysis, and what I mean by that is they're much more interested in looking at chat logs and correlating them with events that are occurring and trying to actually chain together the events by seeing how people are communicating and what they're telling each other, so that you can identify the lack of common ground. Like, so these two people were talking and these events happened after these people were talking. And when we looked at those events, what we realized is they both thought they understood what the other person was saying, but clearly what they did, the events that it caused, prove that they weren't actually saying the same thing to each other. So this is a moment for us to look and talk to those people about how to create better common ground and things like that. So a lot of it, from an objective analytic point of view, is less asking people opinions and more asking people to show how they were communicating, what they were talking about, and correlating those with events that were occurring, so that you can kind of match the social activities with the technical outcome. It's a challenging activity, and I think it's super interesting and totally worth people's time.
Yeah, I love that. I love the qualitative aspect to that. It's we're moving away from the sort of hard numbers and just sort of this thing is to blame and the root cause is this, into more storytelling and stuff, which has so much more value. I think that's awesome.
I think there's this idea that, like, I have a model of the system in my head, you have a model of the system in your head, and there's two things to say about those models. One is that if they're the same model, we've probably created a brittle understanding of the system. But if they're so different from each other that we can't communicate, then we have no common ground. So the activity of this kind of resilience engineering and introspection and kind of post hoc analysis of what's happening partially is about how do we create common ground, how do we create that minimum level of interaction so that we, again, feel safe and understand what each other are talking about. So that's interesting stuff.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so I talked earlier on in this about setting appropriate boundaries and setting time boundaries as well as space boundaries, and I think we are nudging the end of our boundary. So I'm conscious. Right. So so the next Transformation Live is on June 24th, 4 to 5 p.m. What time zone is that? 4 to 5 p.m. Is that Eastern time? I'm guessing that's Eastern time. So register for the next event at red.ht/Transformation Live. If anyone's got any extra questions or just wants to get in touch or whatever, then you can find both Dave and I on Twitter, and I think our links are in the chat and all over the slides. So just find us, ask us questions. We're always happy to geek out about psychological safety and resilience engineering and all sorts of other stuff. So grab us, find us online, talk about stuff, and that would be super, super fun. I think I think everyone's got their books. I think we've assigned. Yeah, we've got some winners. So we've got John Mangrich and Robert Viao, and I love that everyone's challenging me with the pronunciation of the names. Michael Pilkowski and Noelet Stout. Congratulations, everyone! And yeah, that's been awesome. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so we can actually see faces.
So I want to encourage you guys to sign up for the DevOps game because it's a really fun idea. Kevin Bear, who co-authored the Phoenix Project, and John Willis, who co-authored Beyond the Phoenix Project, reanalyzed the book and asked questions about what they would do differently 10 years later. It's a super interesting series. And you get to listen to the original authors of those materials talk about how they see the book and what they might change. So I think it's a fun thing to do, and you guys should totally take advantage.
Brilliant. Right. Yeah. Well, I'll be there if it's not too late. Yeah. Excellent. Right. Well, thanks everyone. I think we're going to stop the broadcast now. So enjoy the rest of your evenings. Stay safe, and yeah, see you soon.
Thanks, Tom. It was fun hanging out.